Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Today I will be offering some commentary on Christopher Hitchens' recent article in Vanity Fair called Trial of the Will. Christopher Hitchens is a man whom I respect greatly. He is, of course, a very outspoken atheist, one of the leading atheist thinkers of our time, and a prolific commentator on culture and society and current events. A very eloquent man whose rhetorical abilities and whose unique style always make for an enjoyable read. I don't always agree with every one of his positions, but it gives me a great deal of pleasure to read his work, and it also greatly pleases me that he continues to write in the face of the terrible predicament that he is in, since he is afflicted with terminal esophageal cancer. In fact, Hitchens' article, I think, can be interpreted in multiple ways, but I do agree with his main thesis. His main thesis is that Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher, was incorrect when he offered the phrase, "Whatever does not kill me makes me stronger." Hitchens makes an extremely valid point throughout his article, supported by numerous examples, that there are quite debilitating conditions, both in a physical sense and in a mental sense, that cannot possibly be said to have redeeming benefits that more than outweigh the suffering that they inflict and the diminution of capacity that they inflict on human beings. This is not just a loss of physical strength. It is also, in the case of many, many diseases, a loss of mental acuity. It is a loss of the richness of the inner world that human beings have. One of Hitchens' great passions is writing, and I think it's tremendously admirable that he continues to write, but he worries about the day when his illness will be so far advanced that he will no longer be able to write. And I completely understand where he is coming from with that. He is faced with a tremendous loss of capacity and tremendous suffering in the meantime, and he essentially has to stare it in the face. I will also say that he is being tremendously courageous in his approach, and that indeed he has the right approach toward confronting a terminal illness. He essentially says that he is continuing to hold out for as long as he can. He is holding out while this illness throws everything it has on him, and he is trying to keep as intellectually active as possible. So, in fact, in the way he has personally chosen to address his predicament thus far, Hitchens is a great role model for how people in that situation ought to behave. Not to relinquish their hold on life, not to wish to accelerate death, but try to fight the illness for as long as possible. This entire article strikes a very tragic note. Hitchens writes, for example, "These are progressive weaknesses," referring to his own condition, "that in a more, quote, normal life might have taken decades to catch up with me. But as with the normal life, one finds that every passing day represents more and more relentlessly subtracted from less and less. In other words, the process both etiolates you and moves you nearer toward death. How could it be otherwise?" And I think this is an excellent summation of the current human predicament, given the current state of medical technology at our disposal. He's absolutely correct. This is indeed the predicament facing all of us, at a slower rate than Hitchens is having to deal with it, certainly, but all of us, absent significant medical intervention, will be faced with this gradual decline in capacities, culminating in the destruction of our very existences. Now, there are several ways to respond to this. I don't subscribe to the tragic worldview, which is the worldview that has been held by most thinkers from antiquity onward because they felt like they had no other alternative. But that's the worldview that acknowledges the tragedy and essentially resigns oneself to it and attempts to live out one's days in a way with dignity. That is not the view that I hold. My view is the meliorist view. I want to alter whatever conditions in the world exist that are not right, not just, and would lead to this kind of tragedy. So I think Hitchens does a very eloquent job here in pinpointing what the tragedy is. Now the question before us, who will probably have a lot more time than Hitchens himself, is what do we do about it? Do we resign ourselves to the problem, or do we become part of the solution in helping contribute our minds and our efforts in whatever ways we are able to the pursuit of indefinite human life extension, and along the way to the pursuit of cures to a variety of debilitating and deadly diseases. Now, Hitchens cites numerous examples of why it is that having been harmed in this way, facing adversity in this way, is not beneficial to the individual. Why this kind of suffering doesn't necessarily have the redeeming characteristic of making the individual stronger. And it's very interesting because it, I think, dovetails nicely with one of the thoughts I have frequently had about the idea that adversity can build character. Many people see individuals coming out of adversity and they see these individuals as having particularly strong wills or great virtues in other respects, and they think that having endured that adverse experience somehow fortified those individuals' characters and built up their wills. I would say that's a mistake of correlation for causation. My view has always been quite different, and that is that it's not adversity that builds character. It is that pre-existing character enables individuals to better overcome adversity. So people of both stronger character and weaker character can be faced with very adverse situations. The people with stronger character already pre-existing will overcome the adverse situation. The people with pre-existing weaker character will be crushed by it. And so the only people you see essentially surviving the adverse circumstances are the people with stronger character. And that's how the correlation arises. But I do think it's a mistake to suggest that, for instance, physical hardship or deprivation or emotional abuse or torment or poverty can improve a human being. Sure, there might be some coincidental side benefits, some chance insights that one gleans from that state of hardship that one wouldn't have gleaned just because one would have been in a different place, in a different environment. But those kinds of serendipitous benefits by no means outweigh the tremendous suffering that these human beings have to go through. And I think this leads to a very common sense realization that bad things are bad for you. And when a bad thing happens to you, there is typically not going to be enough good that comes out of it for it to be beneficial on net. It's clearly the case with many debilitating illnesses, but I think the same case can be made for other phenomena in our society. For instance, with bullying. A lot of people, particularly in older generations, seem to think that being bullied is just a normal, natural part of growing up and interacting with one's peers because it helps people deal with adversity. It helps people learn how to deal with others who aren't particularly friendly, and so forth. And these justifications for bullying, or at least excuses for bullying, are couched in these kinds of nice euphemisms. But in reality, I think bullying can scar the minds of hundreds of thousands and millions of young children, and essentially perpetuate, in many ways, the cycle of bullying as it extends to subsequent generations. So I think the insight that bad things are bad for you can be extrapolated into so many arenas of human activity. Hitchens does a very good job when it comes to severe illness. But there is one example that he cites where I would have a very different interpretation from his own. It seems that Hitchens, at least to a great extent, endorses the perspective of Professor Sidney Hook, who died in 1989. Sidney Hook was a pragmatist, materialist, atheist philosopher who essentially suffered quite severely while he was being brought back from the brink of death. And Hitchens summarizes Hook's experience. Here's what Hook says, and is quoted by Hitchens as saying, "I lay at the point of death. A congestive heart failure was treated for diagnostic purposes by an angiogram that triggered a stroke. Violent and painful hiccups, uninterrupted for several days and nights, prevented the ingestion of food. My left side and one of my vocal cords became paralyzed. Some form of pleurisy set in, and I felt I was drowning in a sea of slime. In one of my lucid intervals, during those days of agony, I asked my physician to discontinue all life-supporting services or show me how to do it." Now this is Hitchens writing. "The physician denied this plea, loftily assuring Hook that, quote, someday I would appreciate the unwisdom of my request. But the Stoic philosopher, from the vantage point of continued life, still insisted that he wished he had been permitted to expire. He gave 3 reasons. Another agonizing stroke had hit him, forcing him to suffer it all over again. His family was being put through a hellish experience. Medical resources were being pointlessly expended." In the course of his essay, he used a potent phrase to describe the position of others who suffer like this, referring to them as lying on, quote, mattress graves. So that, in a nutshell, is Hook's account and what Hitchens perceives the lessons of that account to be. Hitchens ends his narrative about Hook by essentially saying, if being restored to life doesn't count as something that doesn't kill you, then what does? And there seems no meaningful sense in which it made Sidney Hook, quote, stronger. So I agree that Sidney Hook was not made stronger by his experiences. Indeed, by any objective standard, these experiences were quite terrible. But I think Hook, in particular, misunderstood that the situation he was in, however terrible it might have been, was actually a great thing compared to the alternative, which is death. Hook acknowledged in his writing that his condition would not have been possible but for the advanced medicine of his time, which clearly would be more advanced today than it was in the late 1980s. However, Hook himself lamented that this advanced medicine just brought on more suffering. My perspective is very different. It gave him more time. It gave him more time to remain alive in this world, to remain an individual, and to essentially try to leave some sort of legacy, at the very least, or to contribute something to the world and to his own life. So clearly he could create a written account, just as Hitchens can right now. And without that written account, whether or not I agree with all of its contents, I think the world would have been deprived. That is to say, in accord with my view that when a person dies, an entire universe, an entire internal world is extinguished. Because Hook was able to be alive for a little longer, his internal world continued to exist for a bit longer, and we got to see its products. Now, with regard to the three arguments that Hook gave, the first one is he could suffer another stroke in the future. Well, that's true. That's true. That potentiality certainly existed. But in a way, that kind of argument could be made for all of us. That is to say, in our futures, any one of us could suffer something horrible. Any of thousands of horrible accidents or diseases or disorders could be inflicted on us. Is that a reason to wish to have died at any time in the past? I don't think so. So one should think of these kinds of future potentials of debilitating disease or injury, any sort of debilitating and painful condition, as a future adverse event to try to either prevent, or if it can't be altogether prevented, to mitigate its consequences. And if its consequences can't be mitigated, then to persevere through it. Not because it'll make you stronger to persevere through it, but because if you persevere, at least some of you will be left at the other end. His second argument is that his family was being subjected to a hellish experience. Well, again, what is the alternative? The alternative is that he would be dead, and his family would have no opportunity to spend any time with him. His family would have no opportunity to benefit from his existence at all. I mean, what would one's relatives rather have if they really care about the individual? Would they rather have that individual or the mere assurance that that individual isn't, quote, suffering anymore? I think those who really care about a person would care about having that person, especially if that person can be in a mentally lucid state for as long as possible, because that's an opportunity to share some time with that individual and to perhaps even get to know that individual a bit more than his relatives had done in the past. And his third argument is that medical resources were being pointlessly expended. Well, I beg to differ here. What is the point of medical resources if not to prolong human lives? So if medical resources are being devoted to prolonging a human life, to bringing a person back from the brink of death, even if this person is quite elderly or frail or has a high risk of succumbing to another condition, that's still a very important use of medical resources. And no person should be denied the ability to benefit from those resources just because that person is vulnerable to other perils. Clearly, these resources do not stand at a higher level of moral priority than actual human lives. Now, Hook could, if he were still alive, retort to this argument by saying, well, but all the money that was spent on me could have been spent on much younger people, people with greater possible life expectancies if they had been cured of their debilitating conditions. Or he would have said, well, these resources could have been put to better uses, more permanent uses, than helping keep a very old and sick man alive for a few more months. I would respond to that argument by saying that while, of course, I think each individual has the right to refuse treatment if that individual is in a fully mentally cogent state, which Hook was not at the time that his physician refused his request. It's still the case that the life of every individual is of incalculable moral value. So one cannot make this utilitarian comparison of saying, well, because person X will only live a few months if he's given this life-saving treatment, but person Y would live for 60 years if he were given the life-saving treatment that could be bought with the same resources, then it necessarily follows that one should deny the treatment to person X, ideally by person X renouncing it voluntarily, and then give it to person Y. First of all, that suggests that there's some intercomparability in the values of individual human lives. And when we're talking about innocent human beings, however one might define that, but human beings, for instance, who haven't committed vicious murders or comparable crimes, I don't think there's a legitimate moral way to say that in any circumstance, the sacrifice of one innocent person's life is worth it to, quote, save the life of another innocent person. But I don't even think we have to go that far. I think it's sufficient to identify that whole line of argument as a false alternative. The idea is it's not the case that expending medical resources to save the life of another person will necessarily deprive those resources from being used to save the life of another. Because, in reality is much more complex. And resources are not just this homogeneous lump that can be spread in any proportions to any number of people just by the will of some central planner or some philosopher who thinks, well, this is the optimal use of the resources, so we'll divide them this way. No, the resources are highly particularized. They're particular both in terms of what they are, for instance, what sorts of medical instruments are available, what sorts of cures are available to what particular diseases. So, for instance, if there's a 20-year-old out there suffering from an illness, and then there's an 89-year-old out there who's suffering from a different illness, it may well be that the resources are on hand to cure the 89-year-old's illness, but not the 20-year-old's illness, because they're different diseases, and the 89-year-old's illness happens to be better understood by medical science and better managed. So by helping that 89-year-old, you're not somehow depriving the 20-year-old of a cure. That cure wouldn't have been there irrespective of what happened to the 89-year-old. And another way in which medical resources are particularized is in terms of time and place. Where and when are they available? If at the particular hospital where Sidney Hook was, these medical resources were on hand, they couldn't have just effortlessly been deployed to save the life of another person. It would either be save Sidney Hook, or those resources would be idle. And sure, there were people dying all over the world at the same time as Sidney Hook had his brush with death. But so what? It's terrible, it's tragic, but the particular machines and drugs that saved Hook couldn't have just been redeployed to help those people. So, thinking in these cosmic terms about, well, wouldn't it have been better if the medical resources spent on one person would have been spent on another person instead, ignores all of the practical realities of the real world. And those practical realities, what Friedrich Hayek called the circumstances of time and place, combine in myriad ways to prevent these kinds of simplistic alternatives from ever being relevant to actual choices that actual human beings have to make. In the real world, and I know that this is quite an ambitious statement to make, but I think the complexity of the real world does bear it out. It is never necessary to sacrifice one person to save another person. And I'm making an empirical statement here. It is never necessary to do that because with reality being as complex as it is, there is always another way. There is always a way to save both. If you just think hard enough about it, even though most of the time you don't even have to do that, the many alternative solutions are quite readily apparent. So, having dispensed with these kinds of arguments, I think there may have been a more primary motive for Hook to have responded the way he did, and that is he was in terrible pain, and he wanted the pain to stop. And he asked the doctor to end his suffering. On an emotional level, one can certainly understand where he was coming from. The question is that a desire that is consistent with a fully cogent, rational evaluation of what it means to be a living human being? Hook was an atheist and a materialist, so he clearly didn't believe in an afterlife. So he clearly didn't see some good outcome to the cessation of his life. He wouldn't be going to heaven in his own view, for instance. So, in that view, because I share his atheism and materialism, the cessation of the existence of the individual is the worst possible outcome. It is the elimination of the self. It is the inability to even conceive of anything in the world. Not just the future, but also the past. It is the erasure of all of one's memories. And that seems to me, in fact, it is my strong conviction that this is the case. That seems to me to be a much worse fate than any amount of pain. Because after suffering his pain and the terrible uncertainty, of course, that came even after he was temporarily cured, Hook could still write, he could still think, he could still act as himself for a while, and he eventually succumbed to death, very unfortunately and tragically. But I think it's a very good result that he was able to live those extra few months. And the longer he would have been able to live, the better. I wish the same for Hitchens. And I think in this particular respect, perhaps the applications of Hitchens' thesis deserve some revision. It's true. There are many things that won't kill you, at least not right away, but will not make you stronger by any stretch of the imagination. The solution is not to wish for death, ever. The solution is to fight against any of these adverse events, and to try to reverse as many of them as is possible. And if it's not possible at the present time, at least to try to hold out until a reversal could be accomplished. Either do that or die trying, literally. What does one have to lose that is as great as the only life that an individual can ever have? And this internal world, this entire universe within one's mind, is the most precious attribute of any individual. It is the highest value of them all. And to let it be snuffed out for anything, because of pain or because of suffering or because of a misguided philosophical argument, is the greatest tragedy that I can imagine.